and welcome to Trista's Reading Room. Today we are looking at Wings of Truth by Aaron DeMott, and this was published in October 2023. Enric, Crown Prince of Alandra, is resigned to the fact that his people will always be at war with the Vinciti, a hostile race of winged and tailed demon-like people. When the new Vinciti queen offers herself in exchange for captured prisoners, Enric feels, for the first time, that peace might be an option. But before any overtures of peace can be extended, pro-war factions on both sides uncover rumors that the obelisk, a rumored ancient weapon of immense power, has been discovered in the waste to the north of both nations. Can Enric forge an alliance with the Vinciti queen and get to the obelisk before it's used to destroy both nations? This is a standalone, and it is for ages 13 plus. The only content warning is some fantasy/sci-fi violence. You can find the book on Amazon and other online bookstores in paperback, hardback, and ebook. Aaron is the author of the Sci-Gens, not 100% sure how to pronounce that, and the Space Cat series, and the Etherno series. Aaron is a certified Linux nerd who's been a fan of both Star Trek and Star Wars as long as he can remember. Naturally, he writes space opera. He lives in rural Michigan with his wife, 4 kids, and at least 2 cats. You can learn more about Aaron and his books at aarondemott.com. He was binging Thor and assorted anime, and he had an idea, and that's how this book came about. You can find Aaron on his website, Facebook, and Instagram. Chapter 1. A plasma bolt lit up the night sky. Enric sidestepped, and it flew past his left temple. A sharp gasp from behind let him know one of his men hadn't been so lucky. He dropped and rolled down the ditch bank. "How bad?" "I'm fine, sire." Delide ripped off part of his sleeve and tied it around the violet slash across his bicep. "No need for formalities on the battlefield, Delide." Enric grinned. "Besides, if you keep calling me that, people will confuse me with my father." "Incoming fire!" someone yelled out. Streams of red plasma bolts filled the sky. One of the blasts skimmed the top of the mounded dirt that Enric and Delide crouched behind, and lit a few stalks of wheat on fire. Enric frowned at it. If the whole field caught on fire, there wouldn't be any point to this entire battle. Just as he was about to order someone to extinguish it, a soldier jumped up, stamped out the flames, and dove back for cover. Enric looked over at Delide, who nodded back at him. As one, they pulled out their blaster pistols and fired blindly over the top of the ditch bank. The number of plasma bolts decreased slightly. Enric nodded to Delide, and they both rose, blasters ready. A Vinciti warrior charged toward him, blaster in one hand and a sword in the other. Dark purple skin, dull wing claws. Not nobility. Enric snapped off 2 quick shots. The Vinciti with the sword dropped to the dirt. The other shot went wide. 5 more Vinciti warriors charged toward him, and at least one of them had the light purple skin of a noble. That one could be trouble. Delide fired 3 shots. The plasma bolts hit the Vinciti noble in the forearm, shoulder, and chest. They dissipated into his skin. The Vinciti didn't even slow down. Enric pulled his sword, Vindred, from its sheath and leapt over the bank. Enric pointed Vindred straight out in front of him. "Alandrans, hold your fire and wait for my signal. We will defend this land." Enric waited for the Vinciti noble to close, then stepped forward and to his right to meet the Vinciti's blade. The enemy's steel didn't offer much resistance. Vindred's edge continued through the Vinciti's sword, sliced his shoulder, and sucked in another plasma bolt. He spun Vindred in front of him, and the blade glowed orange as it sucked in the plasma bolts. Enric pivoted on his heel and swung for the back of the Vinciti's neck. The Vinciti dropped into a roll, pulled out a small blaster, and fired. Enric winced as the plasma bolt impacted with his ribs. The Vinciti's eyes went wide. He'd probably been expecting the blaster to do more damage. Enric managed to alter his swing to drive Vindred's point through the Vinciti's back. Enric straightened up and sucked in a breath of air. No more Vinciti warriors charged at him. Enric wiped Vindred off on the dead Vinciti's pant leg before returning his sword to its sheath. Delide stepped up to him and saluted. "Sir, the rest of the squad and I managed to capture the other Vinciti while they were distracted by your battle." "Good work." Enric clapped Delide on the shoulder. "Bind them and bring them back to the capital for interrogation." Enric scrambled over the embankment to check on the wounded soldier. He was on his feet and answering a medic's questions, so he probably wasn't too badly injured. Enric nodded to himself and watched the Vin City prisoners as they were loaded into a transport craft. Most of them, especially the violet-skinned nobles, stood tall and proud, refusing to look their captors in the eye as they boarded the transport craft. A few of them fought the entire way and had to be tranquilized, then tossed aboard. As soon as everyone was ready, Enric pressed the wrist control to activate his flight pack and led the way back to the capital. The flight back was uneventful. No further Vin City patrols interrupted the journey. Enric landed at the hangar and then checked over his shoulder to ensure that the rest of his squad landed in formation behind him. He nodded and led the way to the supply officer to turn in his flight gear. Most of the squad dispersed off in various directions, to their bunks for sleep, or to the cafeteria most likely. The lead stepped up and saluted him.
"Permission to accompany you to see the prisoners, sire."
Enric rolled his eyes. "I've already told you that you don't have to be so formal, especially when it's just us." He sighed and headed for the door, waving over his shoulder for the lead to follow. The prisoners had already been transferred to their cells in the short time it took Enric to get to the observation room above the main detention floor. The individual cell blocks lined the main floor below them, and a row of monitors showed the interior of each cell. Every prisoner sat motionless, looking straight ahead.
14 cells, the lead snorted. "What would we do if we ever caught more than a handful of them at a time?"
Enric turned and raised his eyebrows. "Considering that the Secret Service gets almost giddy in the already rare event of any prisoners at all, I'm sure they'd find some way to accommodate them." The lead frowned and tilted his head to the side in acknowledgement. "Well, it looks like the prisoners are secure." Enric yawned. "Excuse me, I'm going to get some sleep. Please let me know if anything requires my attention." The lead saluted him. Enric nodded and left the observation room to head back to his own quarters. No one else interrupted him on the way. Enric entered his room, closed the door and leaned back against it. He yawned and stumbled over the red carpet toward his bed. Blasted Vin City. Why'd they always have to raid at night? He sighed, crossed to his bed, and sat down. He unfastened his weapons belt, tossed it to the nightstand, and started to pull off his shirt. "Security breach in the detention area," the intercom announced. "All forces report in." Enric looked up at the wood-paneled ceiling and sighed, one arm out of his shirt. He shrugged back into it and reached for his weapons belt on the nightstand next to his bed. An alarm rang out just as his fingers touched the buckle. Enric put a hand to each side to make sure Venred and his blaster were secure on his hips as he ran for the door. He turned sideways and launched himself through just as the door started to slide open. He ran down the hallway, the columns starting to blur together as he picked up speed. He skidded to a stop at the entrance to the detention area. "Let me through!" he yelled. A soldier snapped to attention, saluted him, and immediately keyed in the sequence to open the blast door. Enric stepped through the door into the holding area and looked around to survey the damage. Scorch marks covered the white walls and debris littered the floor. A large hole had been blasted in the roof about 50 feet from where he stood, and a female Vin City stood on the edge of the hole 10 feet above the rows of cells. A line of Elandrin soldiers stood off to the left, blasters trained on the intruder. Other than the alarm, it was eerily quiet. Her skin was light purple. A noble, then. Her hair was auburn in color, unusual for her race. The base of her tail was about as thick in diameter as his wrist, and tapered down to end in a thin spade shape about the size of his palm. The claws on her wingtips were larger than average for a female, and silver. This was no ordinary warrior. The glowing purple cylinder she held in her right hand wasn't ordinary either. Enric looked over his shoulder to the line of troops. "Status report." General Torbane stepped forward and saluted him.
"You arrived quickly, Your Highness. She's been standing there since she blew the hole in the roof and has demanded to speak with the king. She hasn't said a word since."
"Any idea what that is?" Enric jerked his chin at the cylinder the Vin City held.
"No, sire,"
General Torbane said.
"However, it's given off cardio radiation."
Enric glanced at the general, then back up at the cylinder. No controls that he could see from this distance. It was about 9 inches long with silver caps on either end. The center tube was translucent. Black gas filled the cylinder and purple light wafted around inside. Cardia radiation? That meant this one hand-sized cylinder had the potential to, theoretically, destroy the entire city. Enric stepped forward and waved the soldiers back. He lifted his chin to address the Vinciti. "The king is away on business. Will the heir to the throne suffice?" The Vinciti stared back down at him, her wings half spread. Enric returned her stare. Her eyes were violet. They weren't haughty or full of hatred. That, too, was unusual. Instead, he almost thought he saw fear in them, or possibly uncertainty. "Are you authorized to meet my demands?" The woman's voice had a clear and pleasant tone, yet another surprise. The other Vinciti he had fought had either deep, gravelly voices or high, shrieking ones. But then, most of them had been trying to kill him. "My father will stand by my word," Enric said. The Vinciti paused. Her gaze flickered down to the sword at his waist, then back up to meet his eyes again. "I want you to release the prisoners that were captured in the last raid on our settlement." Enric frowned. "We raided that farmland to uncover supplies that were stolen from us. The thieves have been apprehended." The Vinciti looked down at the cylinder she held, then back to Enric. "Very well," Enric sighed. "What do you give in exchange for the prisoners, then?" She raised an eyebrow and glanced down at the glowing cylinder. "Not blowing up your city?" Enric's eyes widened. "You do realize that in doing so, you'd kill the prisoners that you're attempting to free. And though we would die, we would most likely kill you before you could escape." The Vinciti's shoulders sagged a little. "I offer myself in exchange for them." Enric raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected that offer. General Torbain leaned closer to Enric.
"We can't trust the word of a Vincenti."
Enric looked over to the general.
"If she'd wanted to kill us, she could have done it without warning."
He turned back to the Vinciti.
"May I have your name, then?"
The Vinciti slowed the flapping of her wings and lowered herself to the floor. She folded her wings to her back and took a step towards Enric. The soldiers around Enric raised their weapons. Enric held up his left palm. "I am Natai, Queen of the Vincenti." Enric cocked his head. The girl didn't look old enough to be the queen, yet she seemed sincere, and intelligence reported that the Vincenti queen had recently died. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough information on internal Vincenti politics to verify that report, or to know how the Vincenti determined their leadership structure. He'd best be cautious in dealing with the girl.
"I was led to believe that the Queen of the Vincenti died in battle a month ago."
"That's true." Natai straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "I am her youngest daughter, now queen." Enric bit his lip. Why would the youngest daughter be promoted to queen? For that matter, why would any Vincenti offer themselves for anyone else? There wasn't anything ordinary about this girl. Still, she was a noble, and she did have a deadly weapon in her hands.
"Sergeant."
Enric held out his hand, and a young man stepped forward.
"Binders, please."
Enric took the binders from the sergeant and stepped toward Natai. She jerked the cylinder up in front of her. It emitted a loud hum and left a purple afterimage. "The prisoners first." Enric paused mid-stride and waved the soldiers back.
"And what's to stop you from leaving with them? If you're serious about your proposal, then I suggest a show of good faith. Allow me to take you into custody. The soldiers will stay back. Then, once the prisoners have been freed, you willingly give up the cylinder."
It was a gamble. The Vincenti were cruel, vicious, and untrustworthy. Enric couldn't be certain that Natai wouldn't detonate the cylinder once the prisoners were freed. This could have been a planned suicide mission from the beginning. Plus, there was no way to know if she really was the queen, or if this was all an elaborate deception. Still, this was the best way he could think of to potentially avoid as many deaths as possible. And the young Vincenti woman seemed different. She was certainly young and possibly naive. Why else would she come up with such a harebrained scheme instead of just attacking? And since when did Vincenti care about what happened to each other? Natai stared into his eyes as she thought the situation over. She swallowed a few times and took short, shallow breaths. Her wingtips twitched.
"She's not sure this is a good idea either," he thought.
Very well, she said eventually. I feel that I can trust you. I surrender myself into your custody as long as the prisoners are freed, and you give me your word that you will be personally responsible for my safety.
You have my word.
Enric stepped forward and Natai held her hands out in front of her. She breathed harder now, and her entire body noticeably trembled. She still clutched the cylinder in a death grip. Enric placed the binders around her wrists. She didn't meet his eyes.
I'm afraid we'll have to bind your wings as well, Your Highness.
A reasonable precaution. May I ask for some of the prisoners to be released first? Enric bent down and looked into her eyes. Her pupils were dilated, and they were a darker shade of violet now, a sign of fear.
Very well.
Enric waved over his shoulder.
General.
Enric grasped her wrist with his left hand as General Torbain walked over to the first cell bank. The Vincenti's arms quivered beneath his hand. She relaxed a little when the first wave of Vincenti prisoners flew out of the hole in the detention block. Enric wrapped binders around her wings, securing them together so she couldn't fly off. She whimpered a little when he did. Were they sensitive? General Torbain walked down the row, entering his access code on each cell. The doors opened and another bank of prisoners was released. Enric stretched out his hand.
The cylinder, Your Highness.
I will surrender it once the last group of prisoners is away. Enric looked down at her with new respect. She was obviously terrified, yet she still had courage. But did she have honor? No Vincenti he had met had seemed to, yet if this one did not, he was gambling with the lives of everyone in the city. He took a deep breath and nodded to the general, who released the last group of prisoners. Enric looked Natai in the eye and placed one hand on the cylinder. It was warm to the touch. Natai released it, and Enric handed it to a soldier.
Take this to the lab for analysis.
Yes, sir. The soldier stepped gently and held the cylinder out away from his chest as he departed. Enric snapped his fingers. Another soldier stepped up to him and stood at attention.
Yes, Your Highness. Take it to a secure cell.
Natai whipped her head around and looked him in the eye. Your word, she whispered. Her eyes pleaded with him, and she shook visibly now.
You will not be harmed.
Could you take me to my cell? You've given me your word that I would not be harmed, and all the stories about the Elandrins due to prisoners. Enric wondered for the first time if Vincenti children were told tales of horror about the evils of the Elandra, just as Elandrin children were told tales about the Vincenti.
Very well.
Enric waved the soldier back and placed his hand under Natai's elbow.
If you would come this way, please.
And that's it for today. If you want to read more of the story, be sure to check it out online and follow Aaron. Have a great day!